Now from earlier today, a Homeland Security conference with Facebook's head of product policy and counterterrorism, Monica Bickert. She talks about efforts to tackle hate speech online and the company's recent decision to hand over 3,000 ads to Congress that were allegedly linked to Russian operatives. Her remarks are followed by Homeland Security Advisor Tom Bossert discussing the future of U.S. counterterrorism policy and hurricane recovery efforts in Puerto Rico. This is just under an hour and a half.
Oh, sorry.
We're live. Hot mic. Well, welcome back. We'll have a few folks sort of coming in from lunch over the next few minutes, so we won't make any news until a few minutes in, Monica. Welcome to our conversation with Facebook titled Security versus Security. I'm Josh Snavely, the Dean of the Business School at Langston University. And we welcome Monica Bickert, who's the head of product policy and counterterrorism at Facebook.
Thanks.
We were here last Friday. There was a movie release called Friend Request. It's a horror movie. So we're here to do a review of that movie because no news has broken since then in Monica's orbit. When Monica agreed or started thinking about this back in the summer, we met at the Aspen Security Forum. Our main focus was going to be on why when I post pictures, no one ever says like or comments. But since then, we've had a lot of things develop, so we're going to get right into it. We will address sort of some of the news of the day, but I want to do that at the end because I want to make sure we spend a lot of time here at the beginning talking about some of the really great, incredible things that Monica and Facebook are doing in the counterterrorism space, which is the goal of this conference. Is to talk about those issues, particularly as it relates to different legal issues. So the frame that we wanted to lay out here is so often, I know many of you have likely been to panels in which it's titled Security versus Liberty, right? Security versus privacy. And it's my view, I know shared by many others, that sometimes is an inappropriate lens by which to view this debate. And I would submit that it is sometimes a poor framework for two reasons. One, it implies sort of a mutually exclusive balance that, in our football or sports culture, that one has to be winning or losing. And that sets us up, I think, for some really complicated things. So we say our security versus security because I think, as we'll highlight with Monica today, that there are a lot of things that industry is doing, whether from an encryption standpoint, work in the security space, that's equally important in many ways to what law enforcement might be doing to fulfill their obligations. So that, by referring to it as some balance between privacy and liberty, it can sometimes, I think, throw off the values of what our great American companies are doing in this space. Second, which we'll spend some time at the end, is there are some really important things that Facebook's doing to preserve free speech. And we heard our first panel talk about that, and there's some really complicated issues around that. So wanted to start with that lens. Because of time, I won't, and you have Monica's bio, but really incredible career both in public and private service. Federal prosecutor, worked in Thailand. Where else, Monica? South Asia?
Chicago and DC.
Okay.
As a prosecutor.
A lot of places. Came over in 2012 to lead Facebook's efforts in this space, and is a real leader. And so it's great to have her here. So without any more intro for me, because you want to hear from Monica, let's talk for a minute. Your title, Head of Product Policy and Counterterrorism. I think that's an industry first. Tell us how, when I told people I was doing that interview, they said, what? Facebook has a what? Tell us about that position, how it came to be, and what you do on a daily basis.
I've been the head of our product policies for more than 4 years now at Facebook, and that entails overseeing our content standards, what people can advertise, how they can advertise it, how they can target it, basically anything relating to how people can use our products. But about a year and a half ago, when we were really trying to double down on terrorist content, propaganda, and terrorists attempting to use social media, we felt as a company like we needed one leader of those efforts. Because what you have are engineers working on technical tools to remove terrorist content, and reviewers who have to be specialists in recognizing terror propaganda and the groups that are pushing this. You have lawyers dealing with government requests and former law enforcement agents that are in the wake of, say, an attack, interacting with law enforcement. They're all working on counterterrorism, but it wasn't a unified team. So we decided to launch that position. I became really interested in it and asked if I could do both, and I was lucky in that I now am leading both of those. So I have product policies and then counterterrorism separately.
Okay. So framing our discussion, security versus security, talk with us a little bit at the outset. Facebook's mission to make a world more open and connected and protect freedom of expression and privacy. How do you address or look at those issues?
Sometimes those issues are in tension, as I'm sure has been discussed today, and sometimes, as you point out, they're not in tension. We certainly see Facebook was created to connect people, and our CEO, Mark Zuckerberg, has talked recently about the value in bringing people together and trying to establish communities. Part of that means we have to make sure that we're protecting speech and the ability for people to express themselves how they want to express themselves and connect very freely with one another. Some of that will only happen if you have privacy. At the same time, we know that people won't come to Facebook if they don't feel safe. So for us to achieve the mission of bringing people to a place where they're really going to speak openly with one another, you actually have to have both. And you have to have privacy means the ability to control who sees your content and when. It also means Facebook adhering to privacy laws, which are different in different parts of the world, and making sure that we're only providing data, whether it's organic content or ads when we're required to. Security means making sure that we don't have our site used for things like planning terror attacks or sexually exploiting children. And of course, there's many other things that privacy and security will bring to mind, but those are some areas where there is no tension. We can really strive to have both, and those areas really work together. And just finally, you mentioned encryption. Encryption is something that we use in a variety of different ways at Facebook. It does not mean that we won't do our part to respond to valid legal process or law enforcement requests. For instance, if there is a crime or in the wake of a terror attack, we can and do provide data to law enforcement. It doesn't mean that we won't also use encryption to make sure that we're keeping people's data safe. And even with end-to-end encryption, which a lot of services use, Facebook does not use, but a lot of services use it, there are reasons that also protects, in addition to privacy, protects security, whether it's protecting health information or sensitive financial information or sensitive government information. So I think it's too easy to say that privacy and security are at odds with one another. I think it's a little more nuanced.
So I want to circle back on some of those points you made, but I want to drill down in a little bit more detail about some of the more specific efforts you all are focused on over the last 2 years, especially the last year, utilizing human moderators and algorithms. So sort of both a human side and a tech side when we're talking about this content online. Tell us about how you utilize both of those and how you balance that in furthering your interests in being a good corporate citizen.
When it comes to enforcing our policies, and I'm just going to focus for now on our content policies, you have policies about terror propaganda, you have policies against bullying, hate speech, sharing personal information, intellectual property misuse, the list goes on. When we enforce our policies in any one of those areas, we use a mix of human reviewers and automation, or different types of technology. Sometimes artificial intelligence, sometimes it's a little more rudimentary, but there's always a mix. And I'll give maybe an example of where this works really well, and then an example of where it doesn't. If you think about terror propaganda, or child exploitation, child pornography, often this is image-based. We can use technology like Microsoft's PhotoDNA to recognize child pornographic images at the time of upload if they are known images. Because that's technology that just matches. It matches a new uploaded image to an image that we already know about. And we can say, we know this image is bad. We can auto-report it to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and it never hits the site. We don't even have, no person at Facebook even has to see it. So that can be a very good use of technology. Thinking about hate speech. Our policies around hate speech, which by the way are increasingly nuanced and have to be applied to more than 2 billion people's posts from around the world, with more than 85% of people on Facebook outside the United States. So we're talking about a lot of different cultures, a lot of different languages, a lot of different ideas about what's okay to share. Our hate speech policies aim to remove any attack against a person or a group of people based on that person's protected characteristics, like race, religion, gender identity, and so forth. There are many ways that you could use words that could be an attack, picture a racial slur, and use them in a way that is not attacking anybody. You could say, this morning on the subway, somebody called me X. Or I think we need to have a conversation in our society about the word X and how we can take it back from negative use. So we would want to take that word down if it's used as an attack, but leave it up if it's used in the context that I just mentioned. That's something where automation has a much harder time. You can use machine learning to try to, I love throwing these terms around like I'm some sort of engineer. Of course, I'm not. I'm sort of repeating what I've learned from the engineers, but you can use machine learning to build a classifier. And basically what that means is you take a whole lot of data about good uses of this word and bad uses of this word, and you feed it through this machine, and the machine, every time it looks at the data, sort of learns from that and gets better at sorting. And after a while, you can use that classifier to look at content and say, this is likely good, this is likely bad. Maybe we send that to our human reviewers, and they can look at it, but we can queue up for them the stuff that we think is likely to be good or likely to be bad. But that's a much harder job for technology. And so right now, when it comes to a lot of our policies, especially things like bullying, harassment, and hate speech, the context really matters, and human review is very important.
To that point, as of now, you had about a 4,500 member team of folks working on that, and you've now made a commitment to increase that close to 7,500, is that right? That'll be sort of in that human moderator role?
That's right, and just to kind of explain what that is, I get a little, when we use words like, sometimes people will call our reviewers moderators, which I think sometimes gives the impression that these people are looking at everything that is posted on Facebook. That's not the case. The way that our process works is anytime you see something on Facebook that you think shouldn't be there, you can report it to us. Whether it's a photo, a post, somebody's page, an ad, a profile, you can report any of that. And if you do, it's reviewed sometimes using automation to help classify things, but often it goes right to a human reviewer. And our human reviewers, these are people who sit around the world in different locations. They are reviewing content 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, in dozens of languages. And their job is to decide whether or not the content that has been reported, or that our automated systems have proactively flagged for review, whether that content violates our policies or not. If it does, take it down. If it does not, they leave it up. In either case, they send a message to the person who reported the content saying, here was our decision. That team sat at around 4,000 a year ago, or 4,000, 4,500, and we have now, as you say, ramped that up by adding another 3,000 people.
And I guess to put context on it, Facebook has about 21,000 employees. There's 2 billion Facebook users. So that's a lot of coverage if people were expecting sort of a one-for-one review.
Well, I should also be clear. So if something is reported, if a piece of content is reported to us, we will review it using a combination of automation, often using human review. But if a piece of content is reported to us 500 times, we do not review the content 500 times. We will review it a couple of times, and then if it does not violate, it doesn't violate, and we'll actually put a protection on it so that we don't continue to review it. You might be surprised, but things like, I like this sports team and my team won and you're angry about it, that sort of post gets reported a lot. So we'll review that a couple times. We're not going to review it 500 times.
I do that quite a bit. Can you talk about the standards that these reviewers are using to analyze this? How do they make that determination? I know there's a lot of criticism out there about them sometimes and what the process is.
So when you're working at this scale, so more than 2 billion people, like I said, dozens of languages, most people outside the United States, the guidelines for reviewers have to be really objective. When as lawyers, we're used to looking at, for instance, a criminal law, and you say, okay, well, in any given case, there will be a trier of fact who will look and see whether or not standards have been met, and we'll look at things like intent. When you're talking about making decisions using reviewers around the world, and you need the decision to be the same on a specific piece of content, let's say it's a photo, whether that photo is reviewed by somebody sitting in the US or somebody sitting in India or somebody sitting in Ireland, you have to end up getting to the same answer. You have to try to take that person's any bias, any subjectivity out of it. So the review guidelines that we write are intentionally very, very objective. If you looked, for instance, at our policies around nudity, in an ideal world, maybe the standard you would want to have would be to say, well, if it's sexual nudity, we'll take it down. But if it is artistic nudity, we will leave it up. If you sit people in a room, even in this room, and you show them images and say, is this artistic or is this sexual? People will not agree. And so you cannot do that with the reviewers. So you end up writing guidance that is very specific and won't necessarily reach the right result in every case. There are always going to be edge cases where you look at a specific photo and say, wow, our policies end up leaving that up. I don't love that. That happens. You will always have edge cases. But there's still a value in having this objective rule. So we write guidance for these reviewers and we update it at least every week, and sometimes more frequently. If something comes out, there's something in the public that we're responding to, let's say there's been an event and there is certain graphic imagery that's being shared from that event, we will make decisions and provide ongoing guidance to the reviewers.
So most of Facebook, I forget the number now, but most of Facebook members are outside the US, correct?
More than 85%, yeah.
And you're talking about these reviewers in every country. You're also faced with a myriad of international laws. Talk about sort of how you balance that, some of the challenges you're seeing from an international perspective, and how those run against US constitutional constraints for that balance.
This is a really interesting landscape and a challenging one. We have seen a number of countries either pass new laws or become more rigorous in their enforcement of existing laws about online speech. And their standards are almost always tighter than US First Amendment standards. They restrict more. And sometimes go beyond what we restrict. So you have First Amendment protections, then you have the Facebook community standards, which is our content standards. And those we do take down, like I said, hate speech. We define that and remove it, even though it's permissible under US law. There are other things that we remove under our standards that are not illegal under US law. Well, above those community standards, you often have laws internationally around things like hate speech or sharing of terror propaganda, support of a terror group, where it's actually criminal speech. And an example of a law that we've seen recently is the German NetzDG law that requires social media companies to delete from their services within 24 hours any manifestly illegal content. And there's a sort of a list of German laws that we as a company are expected to understand and enforce on our site. It's an interesting landscape because it draws into tension the goal of having one borderless community, which basically requires having one set of standards where if I'm sharing it with friends from around the world, we're all seeing the same thing and can comment on it and share it together, versus a more balkanized set of standards where you're satisfying different governments, different cultures, maybe even individuals' different preferences within a country. So you can have that more balkanized system, or you can have this uniform global system, but you really can't have both. We've been trying to walk that line for years at Facebook by saying we're going to have one global set of community standards. If a government tells us about a piece of content and they say this is illegal, even though it doesn't violate your standards, we will require them to submit legal process to us. We will have our legal team review it and see if it's consistent with their laws, if the content is actually covered by the law, this is the appropriate requesting authority, and so forth. And then we'll weigh whether or not we should comply with it. If we ultimately, and there's a whole lot of factors that would go into that, including, is this political speech against the government? How many people do we think would be affected if we remove this speech? If we end up deciding to remove the speech, we do it only in that country. And we then publish that fact in our government request report, which we put out every 6 months. So that's a way that we're sort of trying to straddle that line, but it's getting harder. If you look at our government request report, you'll see that we have had increasing requests from a number of countries. So it's getting harder to straddle that line between having a global community, but also making sure that we are complying with the law where we need to.
Yeah, we could talk about that for hours. I want to shift back to domestic law enforcement and your work there with government. I think post San Bernardino and the events that happened there, we saw a ramping up of this sort of government versus industry in some ways. And I'd like you to talk a little bit about your partnership, your work with law enforcement, because you all do a lot in this space to really make an effort to be a good citizen and to comply with law. So talk about those efforts and what you've done to ramp that up, or how you balance it.
Sure. There's two primary ways that we interact with law enforcement. The first is if we get a request, if we get valid legal process, and the second is when we will proactively provide information to law enforcement. So first, with regard to responding, we have a mechanism through which law enforcement can request user data if they provide the appropriate legal process for their country. Now, as many of you probably know, there are restrictions around what we can provide, and under our terms, we only provide this user data when compelled to. So something that is requesting, for instance, user content from a country outside the United States, often the appropriate avenue for that would be through the Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty process. So they can go through this portal, they submit their legal process. Sometimes they might have to go, for content, they might have to actually go through US authorities and through the MLAT process to get that content from us. We have a team that responds to those requests, and that channel is, much like our content review, manned 24 hours a day. Partly, that's because we sometimes get emergency requests. So if there is a terror attack or something that is a crisis, there's a missing person or somebody in danger, and law enforcement submits something to us, we know that we need to respond right away. And so that channel is always manned. There is literally a box to check if it is emergency legal process, and the law enforcement officials can explain why it's an emergency, and we will respond right away. With proactive referrals, sometimes we will become aware of an imminent threat of harm on Facebook, even though we haven't received legal process. For instance, somebody planning a terror attack. Something like that, we would, and do, proactively refer to law enforcement authorities.
Okay, before we shift into sort of the topic du jour, any other comments or thoughts on the encryption debate and sort of industry perspective about why end-to-end encryption, I know you don't have that at Facebook, but why that's so critical to the role of industry in protecting privacy and your users?
Well, I think well, hopefully people in this room have some familiarity with encryption and why it is important for protecting people's privacy. We hear about hacks all the time, and that's in the news quite regularly. I guess what I hope will happen in the near future is that as people continue to discuss encryption, they'll become more knowledgeable about the different types of encryption and the values and the costs. Because it's not black and white. It's not as simple as saying encryption is always good and there's no cost to it. And it's also not as simple as saying that any use of end-to-end encryption is bad for security for the reasons I mentioned earlier. These are really nuanced topics, and I think the thing that I think we can all do as people who work in this field is get the word out there that there are really different types and different uses of encryption, and there are pros and cons to especially end-to-end encryption for national security.
Well, let's shift. I won't read it here, but Facebook's been the subject of a commander-in-chief tweet this morning about the situation that's going on relative to news and the accuracy of news that's out there and propaganda and the influence of foreign powers in our election. And last Thursday, Mark Zuckerberg came out and released a video in which he highlighted 9 steps that Facebook was taking after releasing to both Robert Mueller and Congress the 9,000 ads that were purchased by
3,000.
3,000 ads that were purchased by Russian-linked entities. So lay out for us a little bit, to the extent you can, because some of these things are ongoing, your efforts in this space.
Sure, and as Josh just mentioned, our founder did post about this last Thursday, and it's something that's a pretty short video to watch, but something I think you might find.
I would encourage you all to go watch it.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people haven't and really see what Facebook is doing.
I think what you'll come away with is a sense that we do as a company take this really seriously. We want Facebook to be a place where there's political discourse, where candidates are free to discuss their views and their ideas, and where people can challenge that and really engage in the sort of speech you should have around any election. We don't want our service to be exploited by people who are trying to manipulate it. And that's why we did this initial investigation, which we undertook on our own, to uncover any abuse of our service during the election. It's why we wrote a post back in April. Our Chief Security Officer, Alex Stamos, put a post up about disinformation on Facebook, where he talked about the efforts that we were undertaking to try to identify any abuse of the platform for the 2016 election and other elections. And now we've come out and said, here's what we found. And I want to be clear, we're still looking. We're gonna keep looking, and Mark said that in his video. We're gonna keep looking both at what's happened in the past and as we go forward to make sure that we're getting better at stopping any abuse of the platform. What are we doing? A couple of the things that Mark mentions. We are cooperating with governmental authorities, and that does mean disclosing the ads both to special counsel we're cooperating and also cooperating with the congressional inquiry. It also means that we are going to focus on transparency in our ads, and I don't know if you've ever run ads on Facebook, hopefully some of you have, but ads on Facebook are most often run from pages. So you create a Facebook page, your page is about your bakery, and from your page, you can run ads on Facebook where you don't necessarily have to link back to your page. You can, but it's just an ad that is linked to that page. Well, what we're going to start moving towards is improving our transparency so that when you see an ad on Facebook, you can see who's behind that ad, you can see that page, and you can then go to the page and see the other ads that page is running. That's part of it, and we're looking at ways to be more transparent there. We're also ramping up our engagement with election commissions around the world so that we can understand the issues that they think they might encounter and what some of their election laws are, and really get ahead of the problem. And then finally, like you mentioned with our reviewers, where we hired more content reviewers, we have specialists at Facebook who are working on election integrity, and we have committed to doubling that number and hiring several hundred new people onto those teams so that we can make sure we're doing everything we can to prevent any abuse of our platform around elections.
Can you talk a little bit about the actual process to purchase ads and how that works?
Sure. Our ads, and we have millions of advertisers, and most ads on our site are self-service, meaning any one of you in this room today can set up a page and then from that page say, I want to promote this post or I want to run this ad. You are prompted to enter some payment information. Of course, we do have checks in place on payments to make sure that we're compliant with all relevant laws, but you submit your payment information and you pick to whom you'd like to target your ad, you submit the creative, and that ad, it goes live. It is reviewed before it goes live with a combination of automated systems and some manual review. For instance, if you tried to upload an ad using the word cocaine, that's something that is going to trigger some review. But by and large, the way ads work on social media is they're dynamic, just like the posts that you see and the photos that you see are. So a lot of this is self-service. These are very small advertisers, a lot of small businesses, and that's an important landscape to understand and for us to try to protect. So when it comes to political ads, which will be the subject of the increased transparency efforts that I was mentioning earlier, anybody can run a political ad. If you have a political cause that's important to you, you can go on Facebook and you can run that ad. But we want to make sure that we're being transparent about where those ads are coming from.
So in addition, this might be our last. We may have time for one more. I don't know if Mr. Bossard's here yet, but Secretary Chertoff mentioned this morning that we need to, on our first panel, sort of get at the preventing the impersonation, the fake question.
Yeah.
How do we deal with that sort of authentication side? So not just the transparency and laying out who folks are, but how do we authenticate that people actually who they are, who they say they are?
So this is a question that we should think about both from a Facebook lens and then a broader industry lens. Facebook is actually somewhat unique among social media platforms in that we require people to use their real names. That means that if you set up a Facebook account and you use Mickey Mouse or something as your name, we will try to detect that. And certainly if it's reported to us, we will look to see if that is your real name. We may ask you for identification. And if we determine that the account's fake, then we will just remove it. Even if the content on the profile is completely fine, we will remove it just for being fake. The ads that we've been talking about, the reason that we removed those was because they were coming from inauthentic accounts. So that's a really powerful tool for us, is requiring authenticity. Not all social media platforms do that. In fact, it's pretty rare. So as we think as a society, as a country, about how to make sure that we're protecting the integrity of conversation around elections, that's something that I think we'll have to talk about.
Well, I think it's something that's going to take us a while to figure out, and I think we need all of industry, Congress, and many others at the table. And we'd invite you to come back next year and give us progress on where you're at. Our time is up. I think we could spend another hour with Monica. So please join me in thanking her.
Thanks.
And we're going to transition now to Tom Bossard and Ken Wainstein.
Okay. I'm going to let Ken introduce our special guest, but I do want to express our thanks to Tom Bossert for taking the time to join us today. We really do appreciate it. We've had a very good conversation so far, and you will certainly be contributing to that, I know, and I know you're literally in the eye of several storms at the moment, and so we really do appreciate it. And I will leave you in moderately good hands, Ken Wainstein. I think you and I have both had the experience of having to work for him, and I will tell you, I survived. It took 12 steps to recover, and I suspect you'll probably have an easier time. But let me turn it over to Ken to introduce our special guest, the Assistant to the President for Homeland Security, Tom Bossert. Thank you.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be here. And I did have the dubious distinction of trying to manage Steve Bunnell, and which is a bit of a misnomer, actually. But actually, it's a treat to be here with Steve and a number of my old friends, colleagues, John Smith, Keith Osbrick, and others. But a particular treat and pleasure and honor to be here with my friend and colleague, Tom Bossert. So Tom has deep experience in the Homeland Security area, dating back throughout his whole career. I got to know him in 2008, I believe it was, when I came on as Homeland Security Advisor, the job he has now. And I came in as a guy to do something about law enforcement and counterterrorism intelligence operations. Had no idea what the Stafford Act was, no idea, knew very little about resiliency. And I looked around at people in the Homeland Security Council who I felt would be particularly helpful and could help me get up to speed on these things. And Tom was the first person I looked to. And Tom ultimately, partway through my tenure there, became the deputy. And I, relying, it'd be an understatement to say that I relied on him. So it's been a real particular pleasure and for me to see Tom ascend to this position and do the fantastic job that he's done so far. Let me echo Steve's thanks for you being here, given the few things on your plate right now. It's a plate that's always full, and it's full of very diverse things, just as I alluded to, everything from law enforcement to counterterrorism to pandemic flu to natural disasters. But that's made particularly more difficult and complicated in hurricane season, especially when you have one like this, which is almost unprecedented in terms of the relentlessness of the hurricanes that have been hitting us. So thanks to Tom for being here. So what I think we'll do is I'm just going to tee up some topics for you, Tom. And
thank you. I'm still in the denial stage of my 12-step recovery. Before you tee me up with that, just a few introductory remarks. First, thank you very much for having me here. It's not your honor, it's mine to be here to speak to this group, and recognizing that a lot of you here have taught me what it is that I think I know. I'll be very respectful of giving you my thoughts and opinions here, knowing that you'll probably still know more than me and continue to. But maybe a few also lighthearted remarks. Monica Bickert does a great job, and I want to stay here now for the record on behalf of the administration that what they do to take terrorism related information off of the open internet is absolutely breathtaking, remarkable, and kudos to them and the other social media sites that have really led in this space. And then just a funny anecdote, Monica and I took a picture intentionally of ourselves in front of a bar out in Aspen named ISIS, for any of you who've been out there. And we jokingly said we should post this and see if your algorithm can take that ISIS material off the internet. We haven't done it yet. We didn't want to test and find out a failure, but I believe that they could take that off, and I believe Monica's efforts would bear some real examination later to support her being nominated for a lot of accolades. So, Ken, thanks for having me here. August panel, thank you for listening to me, and then forgive me as I ramble because it's been a little bit of a tiring week.
So the real question about that story is, did you end up going into the bar?
No.
Okay.
No,
So I think both you and she could probably use a drink.
No,
right about now.
we could, but we did not. And maybe one other anecdote for those of you that follow this. Yesterday was the 70th anniversary of the National Security Council. And today we commemorated that inside the building with the, all hands, 250 person, H.R. McMaster and I kind of led this kind of conversation, a walk down history lane. And it really struck me that the National Security Council and its staff structure has evolved quite a bit since its formation. But to mark its 70th anniversary, it's pretty interesting now to note that since 2001, it has made more changes in the last 16 years than it made in its collective, prior 60 and or 50, 55. So it now includes hurricanes, cyber threats, terrorism, things that are asymmetrical in nature, and it's really an inspiration to sit and watch that team. So I'm thrilled to be there, and happy 70th anniversary to the National Security Council.
Okay. All right. Well, let's tee up some topics. So let's start with something that's right in the heartland of your responsibilities, the NFL.
I prefer to stand.
Okay. There we go. Amen. So no, let's go straight to hurricanes. I think you teed up the issue quite nicely. It's the National Security Council, its slate of responsibilities has evolved and reformed, or changed dramatically over the last 16 years. Nowhere as much as the natural disaster response recovery effort, which now is a central part of both Homeland Security Council and now National Security Council operations. So if you would, just given your deep experience dating back to Katrina in hurricanes, if you would give us an idea of the particular challenges that have been presented to you all by each of these hurricanes, and each one has been different.
For some reason, even with an 8-year break in government service, I have been in some management responsible role for every major hurricane since 2003 to hit the United States. I don't know if that's a good or bad thing, but it did make me uniquely, I think, competent, I don't know about qualified, to sit and manage this particular process, and I couldn't be any happier with the federal government's response. So it's an unprecedented storm season in a lot of metrics, but it's by and large an unprecedented and successful unified effort in terms of response. So we have a long road to go here, or path to hoe, with Puerto Rico, so I don't want to do any kind of victory lap, but this has been the best, and the fact that we've done it back to back to back, and with the kind of insular territorial island challenge, and then 2 states at the same time, I couldn't be any prouder. So maybe though the bigger observational answer is this. The NSC structure has always been staff organized around regions, right? And even when you and I look at the history of it, Ken, we see a Russia desk or an Asia desk and a Middle East desk, and we looked at these regional problems because those regional governments tend to present us the biggest national security threat. And after 9/11, we realized, maybe not even consciously in the beginning, that we needed a functional organizational model. And the Homeland Security Council concept ended up with a counterterrorism directorate and a cybersecurity directorate and a resilience now directorate. We called it preparedness and response then. But these are functions that are translatable skills that move across any area or region of the globe, and they're transnational in nature. And so they now include as well this kind of all hazards concept, where a number of things like earthquakes and hurricanes can be large and consequential enough that they literally threaten the national security, our ability to maintain our economy. And so the big challenge for me at the White House, instead of getting into the operations of FEMA or DHS, is to contain the effects from going into a spiral from local to regional to national. And what we saw in Katrina was we came really close to losing that handle. The regional problem of power outages almost led to the loss of the two big pipelines that supply the entire East Coast. And that cascaded into an international demand and supply problem with the oil markets. So what you try to do is contain first, make sure the president's aware of those big picture items, and then make sure that there's a competent, coordinated federal government effort underway to support the state. And I'll tell you, the traction I've gotten out of just repeating the basics is really reassuring. God bless you. The idea of supporting the governor and not doing the governor's job is really, paramount for me to stress. And we have now had Governor Abbott, Governor Scott do a tremendous bang-up job, and the governors of Alabama and Georgia as well, deal. But now we've got two governors in two territorial islands, really, that could have easily folded under this pressure, and they didn't. So Governor Mapp in the Virgin Islands, I flew down to see him on Monday. He is working around the clock. He's showing every leadership instinct you'd like to see out of a big state governor, and he's in a small island, fairly remote and removed. It's pretty inspirational. And he's marshaling the resources of 12 Navy ships and all the Marine and rotary aircraft support that you'd expect a three-star general to marshal. And he's doing it effortlessly. And then the same goes with the governor of Puerto Rico, and he's dealing with problems that are very unique. So I'll tell you what we've done, though, with Puerto Rico. We haven't taken it over. We haven't lost control. The governor hasn't lost control, but we've adjusted our business model. Not because they're incompetent. They're not. They're very competent. And not because they lack some skill or leadership quality, but because they've lost capacity. So if you look at the energy restoration workers that live there, they're all victims. And if you look at the emergency staff that support the local municipalities, 80% of them have lost their homes, or in some way their families have, so they're victims as well. They're survivors. We don't like victims, but they've nevertheless suffered. So we're augmenting their capacity now, not at a state level, but at a local level. So we're helping them pull resources, and then we're sitting at the top helping push them the way we would traditionally do it. And so that's a unique business model, and that's something we learned after Katrina, and I know you experienced that. So that's where we are. We're doing well. The governors are doing well. The Puerto Rican people are showing the same resilience and compassion that we saw the people of Texas show, and I think that's a real testament. And then maybe just one defensive point here. I saw on the news today people were criticizing the administration for not waiving the Jones Act. So there's some lawyers here. I'll get technical on you. There's a particular law that prohibits non-U.S. flagged vessels from moving between domestic ports. Well, whether you agree with the merits of that law, it's been in place for a long time, and we often waive it when we need excess capacity, so we can allow foreign flagged vessels to augment the U.S. fleet to bring needed commodities, generally fuel and refined fuel products or oil, into the affected area. We did that with Texas. We did it in particular with Florida because the entire peninsula requires shipping by ship. It doesn't have a pipeline structure like the rest of our East Coast. We did not do it for Puerto Rico, and there are people asserting for political purposes that we're doing something that's different and therefore less supportive of the Puerto Rican people. Not true, flat out. I'll stand by this decision every day. The problem is an analysis of capacity and requirement. We've got plenty of U.S. flagged vessels and plenty of capacity to exceed the requirement, period. It's the end of it. So you only waive that which is in your way. This was not in our way. The problem was once you got the refined product onto the island, you had to distribute it on ground. That's been a slow point for us, but it has not been getting the product to the island, and so we didn't waive it. And so the message here is we've got American supplies being shipped by American flagged vessels to help American citizens. And the Puerto Rican citizens are American citizens. And so this is a good news story, and for those people suggesting otherwise, I'll commend you all to the Jones Act, and you can help defend me.
Okay, fair enough. Why don't you just take a couple minutes, if you would, and give people a sense of the role of the National Security Council in going, the life cycle of a disaster. I'm not sure that people really understand the centrality of the role that the White House plays.
Well, so in any context, in counterterrorism, which is a global concern, or cyber, which is a transnational global concern, or in the domestic context, it's not just domestic. We had an earthquake that hit while we were in UNGA, and I was doing meetings on counterterrorism with foreign leaders, and there was a hurricane at the same time. So you balance this, and the idea is, and there's been some evolution in the last 70 years, but the idea of the National Security Council staff, and we're all staff, the president's been elected, he's got authorities, the cabinet has authorities and money. The rest of us support this effort. The idea for us is to kind of get over this policy-making hill. So we articulate options for the president and make recommendations for the president, two different things. And they have to be feasible options, and they have to be well-informed recommendations, and we have to coordinate the cabinet and all their subordinate staff with their expertise and their knowledge of authorities and their available resources. And then we have to help the president, once he makes a decision, on the other side of the hill, track implementation. And that's where you can get into trouble. So tracking implementation and staying on top of it can be done properly, and we can have a sustainable number of meetings to do that and have metrics of trust, or we can have metrics of distrust and micromanagement and meet too often and irresponsibly and get in the way of their implementation schedules, and we can then hold them accountable in a way that ends up pulling the reins in too tightly and putting us in charge of operations. And every once in a while, you'll have a staffer that decides they can actually direct operations out of the White House. And when they get away with it, it's just annoying in that 12,000-mile screwdriver we talk about. And when they do it in a way that there was no authority to support, or worse, we end up with our contra allegations and so forth. So the trick is to coordinate. At my level, I coordinate the cabinet. At my deputy's level, the deputy secretaries, and below that, the assistant secretaries or under secretaries. And if you coordinate them and note all their positions and faithfully serve your role as coordinator, then you're doing the president a service. And you wait until that very last moment when it's fair to explain to the president. And I would, if I can, tell you that Ken Weinstein excelled at this. Often presidents get, a little bit cranky, right? I've worked now for two that are impatient at times because of the demands of their schedule. And they want to know, what should I do? What should I do? What's your opinion? And Ken was pretty good, and he taught me this, really good. Don't tell the president what he wants to hear. Don't engage in confirmation bias. And most importantly, start by telling the president the opinions of his cabinet members. Otherwise, they're going to resent you for being there close to him all the time, and it breeds all sorts of contempt, and that's bad. What we'll do is say your attorney general believes you should turn left, your secretary of defense believes you should go straight ahead, and your other three secretaries of relevance here think you should turn right, or maybe just sit still for a little while. And then at the end of that, sometimes frustrating process, he'll say, great, what do you think? And then and only then, I think, is it appropriate for I or General McMaster or General Kelly to give the president our personal views. That will generally sum up what we do for a living, but there's a whole lot that goes into it. And I learned today that two staffers in the early creation of the National Security Council staff actually worked to death. And so
Worked to death.
They worked to death. And so I'm sure there was some other causality for those Falls-Graph proximate cause analyzers out there, but there were two people that actually worked so hard that they died in the job. And I can tell you that the staff work 18 hours a day, and they can't afford to make a mistake. And one of the young staff came up to me and said, we're sharing stories, and he said, I, on my first day, had an opportunity to go in and brief the president. I didn't know where I was or what was going on, and there's a long story to it. And I uttered a sentence, thinking it was innocuous, and 10 seconds later, the President of the United States is on the phone with Putin uttering that sentence. And I said, you have to realize the power you have around here, and you have to be careful not to say things that are glib or wrong or not fact-checked. And so it's a high-stress environment, and you have to constantly be on top of what you're thinking and doing because you're near literally the most powerful people in the world, and it's a great honor. So that's what we do.
I could see the next all-hands meeting Tom has. I know you guys have tough work conditions, but you're not working yourselves to death.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah.
Back in the old days,
Yeah.
they worked themselves to death.
At least one of you.
So look, at the risk of being too inside baseball-ish and too geeky, but I can't help it, I'm a geek. We've talked about the changes to the National Security Council. So you had the NSC, President Bush, and then Congress established the Homeland Security Council. You had Homeland Security Advisor, National Security Advisor. Then President Obama came in, I think he commissioned John Brennan to do a review of the structure, make a recommendation. They recommended folding the two basically into each other. Homeland Security Advisor teamed up with the National Security Advisor. And then this administration has made some tweaks to that. Without sort of going through the history, how do you think it's playing out now? Because obviously there are a number of different concerns at play. One is there's a whole constituency that's sort of the Homeland Security constituency that came to the fore after Katrina, and that we hear from, and there's always been a concern registered by them that maybe Homeland Security concerns as sort of generally understood, might be subordinated to national security concerns, the more traditional ones.
Yeah.
How do you think it's playing out? Do you think that's a real concern?
Yeah, no, it's a real concern. It's a good question, and I can give you the short answer. We went from too hot to too cold to just right. And where we are right now is just right. I believe that in my heart. Too hot, meaning we had a separate National and Homeland Security Council staff coordinating the same cabinet, by and large. We were constantly functional here and regional here, for the most part, in some form of separate coopetition. It was frustrating at the staff level. I served there. I might be the only person that's ever held every job, right? The policy jobs, the director, senior director, SAP, DAP, deputy assistant, and then AP, which is kind of the triple in the cycle, if you will. So what the Obama team did, I think understandably and rightly, was to combine the two staff structures into one unified staff support model. But what they chose to do was take the position you and I held, or you held before, and subordinate it to a degree, but they played a little bit of a trick there. And they had John Brennan and Lisa Monaco, I think this year, be a deputy to the National Security Advisor, but retain the same rank title and open door access to the president, so as to avoid the concern that counterterrorism would take a backseat to, let's say, peace in the Middle East. And so other people have opined that that was the case. I think you could just as easily attribute any policy decisions that were made in the last 8 years to the president's preferences and not the organizational structure he adopted. But personalities make a difference, and org structures do sometimes matter. What President Trump decided to do, I think wisely, and I spent quite a bit of time talking to him about this in transition, was to take my current position and re-elevate it, so to speak, to the position you held and that Fran Townsend held before you, and to some degree Tom Ridge and General Gordon. And so what we've got is a matricized combined HSC NSC staff under the name and rubric of the National Security Council staff now, which is good, and it's got that historic, honorable name and position, but it's led by two people. Now, H.R. McMaster, the National Security Advisor, takes a special role and prominence here. And if there's any particular disagreement between he and I, often, especially if there's an international component or flavor to it, I'll often cede to his judgment as he understands the world and the global interactions. But generally not. Generally, the president wants to know my view and his. And generally, he and I speak pretty much the same language, and we're able to take different positions without being argumentative in any way. But what's nice and neat about that is this matrix staff has a place to go. And so if you end up feeling like, well, maybe my point of view will be dismissed routinely because one of the two principals tends to not agree with my point of view, well, you've got two principals. And for the most part now, President Trump's become very comfortable with that. In the very beginning, just like with President Bush, we had to constantly remind him, sir, I don't handle North Korea, and HR says, I don't handle cyber and hurricanes. So once he got that in the first couple of weeks, I think we've demonstrated that this is the just right model. I'd advocate it for the future, but personalities can dictate that.
Okay. All right, you just mentioned cyber.
Yeah.
And you are, I think, by all accounts, and I think rightfully, can claim to be an expert in cyber matters. You've been working with them for years. I remember you banging that drum with me when I first came in, the need to be a little bit more aggressive against the cyber threat.
Yep.
And I know you worked on cyber matters quite a bit in your 8 years outside the government.
Yep.
Just give you sort of an open-ended question. Where do you see the state of cybersecurity? Where do you see, and obviously the government is not the only player here by any means, but in terms of where the government's going and what plans you might have for bringing up cybersecurity going forward?
The easy part of that question is, how do I see the cyber threat? And I see it as a trend line going in the wrong direction in a big time way. It is a shared responsibility between government, private actors, international and domestic, and individual accountability, which sometimes gets lost in this conversation. But the trend line on cyber threats is going in the wrong direction, and the capabilities of the bad guys at this point are matriculating out into what we would have considered before a smaller or lesser threat. There is no such thing anymore. We've got very advanced cyber adversaries that are operating in what would be either very small countries or in non-nation state criminal organizations. These are things I think you already know. We've talked about this quite a bit. There's a 6 or 7 pages worth of dozens and dozens of recommendations that I think you'll see coming from us, the administration, in the form of an upcoming strategy, in the form of a NIST framework update, and there's a number of things that you'll see us do. But at the strategic level, let me see if I can answer the second part of your question. I think it's time, and I think this president will lead in this fashion, to articulate a better and different vision. So instead of putting forth a strategy that simply knits together our current capabilities in a way that address the problem, I think it's time for us to start having a conversation as a country about what it is we can tolerate our government doing, because our government needs to be more involved, I think, and I believe the president believes, in protecting a broader set of national interests. We've got certain critical infrastructures that are so critical to the functioning and survival of our country and its economy that we have to do more to protect them from foreign adversaries online. And I think it's also probably a time for us now to concede that there is a low-level, low-intensity, constant conflict going on online at this point every day. There is no way around that. There is no clear malefactor. There are thousands of malefactors, all with their own interests. And at this point, we have to take the rhetoric of increased defenses and elaborate. Increased defense is going to impose a cost on the bad guy, on the malefactor in this case, whether he's a criminal or a nation-state actor. But it's also going to do something a little bit different. It's going to impose costs, and that serves as a deterrent. But it's going to protect us in a baseline way that doesn't make us the most vulnerable country on earth. Right now, this country, the United States, is great for a lot of reasons, and one of them is that we invented the internet and we've used it to great purpose, and we've created lots of different conveniences for ourselves. But in so doing, we've also put ourselves in a vulnerable position that I think dictates and requires that we act a little bit more together. And maybe I could articulate to this audience something that I kind of hold in my worldview. And I say that because you're mostly lawyers, I think. The idea here is that the analogies to war and Talon Manual, for those that follow that, are good and useful in a lot of ways. The multilateral efforts to develop norms are good in a lot of ways, and I'll come back to that. But from my perspective, we've lost a little bit of the civil liability calculus here. There's a property analysis here. At this point, we've talked about it as a crime or an act of war. But remember, too, that we've got the ability to exclude others from using our property, right? Not just the right to use our property or transfer it without third-party intervention. This is a fundamental part of the bundle of property rights that lead to capitalism itself. And I think that that ability to trade and use property as we deem fit without hurting those around us and then excluding others from using it is a useful way of thinking about the role of government. We never in this country object to civil courts enforcing contracts and promises between two businessmen or women. And we never think of that as get out of our lives government. In other words, we've intentionally designed our government to separate it from religion. But we've intentionally designed our government structures to support our socioeconomic preference of capitalism. And because of that, I think we should recognize it and embrace it. And in lots of ways, rely on our government. You know, I went to Israel and announced our first U.S. Bilateral cybersecurity agreement with the Israelis. And in their country, if there's a cyber attack, almost every one of their citizens immediately says, well, where's the government? Right? And it's a fundamentally different point of view. They have a trust and they have a different view of their government's role in protecting them. And I've now been out on the record calling what they do a virtual Iron Dome, if you will. There's a lot of benefit there, but they've got a small country and the capacity to do that. We can't, even if we wanted to, and I don't advocate it, protect every network and system inside our country. But I think we can take some lessons from what the Israelis have done. And I think the British have led the way on this. They've tailored that approach to their needs in their system with their sensibilities of privacy. And they've extended some government-led defensive measures to those very critical components of their society that require some extra defenses in the name of national security. And I think that we should start contemplating doing the same. So that's half of the deterrence model. We've had an executive order that President Trump put out in the beginning of his tenure to also concede that we have to practice what we preach and start at home. And I'll preach this to each of you. As I said, I'd come back to personal accountability. Protect your own systems. And if you're running a company, protect your company's systems instead of worrying about what everybody else is doing. Often I see people that are cyber experts preaching what everyone else should do, and they're sitting on top of poorly secured networks and bad systems and antiquated software and hardware because they don't want to put the money and time into patching and updating. And that's a kind of a hypocrisy that doesn't sit right with me. And so we started here with the federal government and decided that we needed to improve the security of the federal networks. And that's an effort that's underway right now. And it started with a very clear-minded, clear-eyed call that we need to stop supporting antiquated technology and immediately begin the procurement process reform of buying shared services and getting on with the fact that you can't replicate an adequate security model in every department and agency, given the budget constraints and the jurisdictions and the expertise that we have resident in 190 different federal departments and agencies. And so President Trump put out a pretty aggressive executive order that says from this point forward, shared services, cloud services, shared security services, and modernized IT networks. And I'm really thrilled that people with a lot of business background like Jared Kushner and Chris Liddell and others have taken the mantle to run that down to ground and to handle the implementation coordination I talked about on that policy hill. So we've put that in place, and hopefully we get a little bit better there. And just as an anecdote, you'll remember the OPM breach. Had we had defensible hardware and software, which we did not, we would have been able to prevent that breach. And I think that breach was one of the most costly in terms of the loss of probably a lot of your security clearance backgrounds. I know mine and Ken's were affected. And then I'll end with where I started in this shared responsibility model, and that's the second part of the 3 parts of our executive order. That is, how are we going to handle the critical infrastructure owners and operators? And the way we're going to do it is to continue to bolster the Department of Homeland Security's critical role, the FBI's critical role, and the Secret Service role, partnering with our intelligence community when appropriate. But we're going to further narrow what is critical from the monolith of critical infrastructure. And Joe's here, he knows how we started with the critical infrastructure key resources, and there were so many sectors and so many members in each sector that it became everybody being eligible. And we've narrowed it down to that very small group of what we call Section 9 entities. And I think that's where we're going to end up focusing a lot of our initial efforts. And that's it. That's the roadmap of where I think we're going to end up. What I left out was the other half of the coin on deterrence, and that's the hard part, so I'll probably leave that out intentionally. But you can deter with defense, but you can then also deter by taking either a kinetic or a punitive step in trade practices or sanctions. And when that's merited, I think that we should reserve the right to act unilaterally. I know we will. But I would prefer to explore acting at very least in a bilateral way in between now and that great future day when we can have a group of multilateral thinkers or shared allies, right? So we've got different ways of referring to it. The GGE in the UN is a great multilateral body. They've done a lot to get us to a place where we have agreed upon norms among the like-minded. I think that's great. It should be commended. But I think my experience is that multilateral organizations aren't very good at enforcing when there's a violation. If you take the UN Security Council as a model, there are always other considerations that tend to prevent a group body from reaching a consensus to punish one of its members. And so I think what we'll do is reserve the right to act unilaterally in rare cases where punitive measures are necessary, prefer to act bilaterally for the purposes of assuring the public that there was some degree of adequate evidence, attribution, and proportionality in the force that we use or the sanction that we impose. But we're not quite ready yet, and I think we would never publish our playbook. But I think it's my sense, and it's the cabinet sense, that we have to start doing and developing a record of conduct to examine as opposed to thinking. Otherwise, we'll never settle in on a subjective perfect sweet spot. I'm not suggesting that we will dabble or play jazz music in an irresponsible way, so to speak. But I am suggesting that on occasion when it's necessary to smack somebody in the nose for doing something that's clearly wrong, that we'll do so. So that's it on cyber.
Just that? That's all?
That would be how I would have briefed you. I honestly, it's probably the first time I've articulated that in public, so I really do respect this group's view on it. And I know you've met for the last few days to think through all the thorny legal challenges that accompany that kind of a cavalier, high-level articulation of where I'd like us to go. So I would encourage each of you to keep looking at what we're doing, because the number of interlocking laws and liabilities and considerations and motivations from the private sector tend to create bad and odd, weird, unanticipated second and third tier effects, and that's what we always fear in policymaking, that we do something that makes sense and it turns out to be a bad idea.
No, that was a great sort of overview and sort of a feast of food for thought in so many different respects. But I guess let me just follow up on one of the last points you made about an international body that would have enforcement teeth to deal with cyber offenses, especially by the nation states. Do you see that as being a real possibility? Do you see there being any movement in that direction? And I agree with you. You look at the circumstances, it just seems like the natural sort of way to address this ultimately. But
I know that there are some companies, and I agree with a lot of what they say, that advocate for kind of this Geneva Convention type of model. And I know that there's, Brad's a friend, and I know that there's some attractiveness to it. But when you look into the implementation, and you think about some of our friends and enemies who come out and say with great indignity, I can't believe you won't share with us all the information and all the data and intelligence that you've used to determine that somebody did something wrong. It's almost galling to see people and how easily they can lie to you with a straight face. So I think what you have to balance is our own national and self-interests with the appealing but problematic notion of group consensus in an international forum. And in the cyber arena, I don't think that it's ripe for international and kind of consensus-based enforcement right now, but that's the objective.
Okay, let me pivot over to counterterrorism for a minute. We had heard some very interesting, insightful remarks from Lisa Monaco earlier today about where things are in terms of counterterrorism effort or the terrorism threat generally, and then also the effort to meet that threat. Focused on the fact that ISIS has a shrinking base now, and that's causing it to change its mode of operations. As to that particular issue, where do you see ISIS going? Where do you see its threat manifesting itself? And then where do you see sort of the broader terrorism threat and how we're trying to meet it both strategically and tactically?
We are taking quite literally President Trump's guidance to annihilate ISIS from the face of the earth. And I know that sounds maybe shocking, but the idea here is that has two implications. An annihilation strategy, quite literally in a military context, is the difference between what we have as a country done previously, which would be to approach them and drive them out of a city, to now surrounding them and killing them. I know that sounds gruesome, but it's absolutely merited. And that is how we've cleared Mosul, and that is how I believe our by, with, and through partners approach and strategy with our U.S. military is going to drive ISIS from Raqqa. Now, that said, we have still a significant landmass of the Middle East governed by ISIS with so-called physical caliphate, and it's going to take some time to continue to operate in a way that shrinks their control over physical space. But the way I see it shifting, Monica was here for a good reason, because they're going to shift from physical space to virtual space. And we're going to have to accommodate that, and we're going to have to decide where our social sensibilities are in terms of what is and is not viable online speech, but also, from my perspective, I don't think there's any such thing as a First Amendment problem here. Terrorism speech is just flat out something that should be removed, and generally speaking, a lot of it's so easy that it's not worth the debate. Taking a video of a beheading off is easy peasy in my view. No, we're also going to have to take into account this diaspora consideration that I suspect that Lisa talked to you about. I've stayed in touch with Lisa. Some people call it a snowball, right? You squeeze it tight enough and you see it squirt out. There are going to be ISIS movers that are resilient. They've demonstrated the same resilience, unfortunately, as other previous adversaries in our history. And they will find different places to operate, different safe havens. And what we've seen, then, to expand to your first, I think, real principle there, they've expanded into, and this is not meant to be alarmist, but we've got now a terrorist presence, both ISIS, as they spread and return home from certain combat operations, but also Al-Qaeda and affiliated groups, Boko Haram, into 18 different nation states that are in various degree of instability or civil unrest or loss of government control. And so at this point, I'd say it's a comparative analysis problem. Ken and I left, and we were using the AUMF to conduct military force in 2 countries against 2 groups that we had kind of our hands around, so to speak, in our view. And I came back into government service and was blown away that we have now terrorists in a significant concentration spread across the Sahel region of Africa, all of North Africa, and all throughout the Middle East. And now we're tracking quite closely ongoing operations to take ISIS fighters out of the Philippines. And you're seeing operations in Malawi in the Philippines right now where there's still 60, 70 fighters. We're taking back mosques. They're fighting block by block. And so this is a truly alarming trend line of the global jihadi threat. And I think that we've decided to take a constant and applied pressure strategy here. And so this is not too complicated a strategy, but it is an increase in pressure. It's an increase in sustained applied pressure. And instead of just taking out a high-value target here and there, this administration is pursuing networks and their support. And that's how we're, I think, going to take it back from a spreading lawn into a more controllable and addressable threat now. That said, we can't just win this thing militarily. We're going to need the help and support, and President Trump's been clear about this, of other nation states who have to care about their own safety just as much as we do care about their safety, if not more. And they're going to have to start contributing to it instead of picking up the phone and calling us and saying, hey, can you just give us more help? The American people need schools in Brooklyn as bad as they need to defeat a terrorist in Mosul. And we need to make sure we balance those domestic and international concerns. That said, though, we're demonstrating some leadership. People weren't sure President Trump would be able to do that, and I can tell you he knocked it out of the park in UNGA last week. I was with him for all those meetings. The foreign partners that we engaged with, and there were many, were thrilled. We spent time between the President of the United States and the leaders of small countries in Africa and large countries in Europe. And I think it was absolutely a masterful stroke, the speech aside, which I thought was good, but the speech got all the analysis. What people didn't analyze was the fact that he spent the entire week there meeting all day, all night with foreign leaders on real substance. And so I think he showed some leadership there. And to get a unanimous vote out of the UN Security Council against, and with the same purpose in mind, the behaviors of the North Koreans, I think is also laudable. So it's terrorism, but he's demonstrating kind of a consistency that people can get behind. And defeating ISIS, everybody's on board. So there's more money. There's a 68, maybe now 70 member coalition, because we've added Interpol and other members. And it's breathtaking in its collaboration.
Okay, at the risk of getting the hook because of time constraints, I just want to put a pitch in for what is, I think, a jointly...
I've never met an unexpressed thought.
A jointly held pet issue, which is 702, which is shorthand for the FISA Amendments Act, which was passed in 2008, and the authority within the FISA Amendments Act, which is due to expire unless it's reauthorized this year, which allows the intelligence community to surveil non-U.S. persons overseas for counterterrorism and other national security purposes. And all the more important given the situation that you're diagnosing now, where you have ISIS sort of metastasizing and spreading out, and you have a particular need then for surveillance to be nimble and be able to move from one target to the next as national security imperatives evolve, without having to go back to the FISA court to get an order from the FISA court every time you do that. Where do you see the debate right now? Where do you see the 702 reauthorization going between now and the end of the year, and what can we do to make sure that it gets passed?
The administration's position, and I'm very serious with this, is a clean and permanent reauthorization. Period. Now, I'm sitting next to, and you're looking at the guy that's probably the world's expert on this, so if you want later to ask a lot of questions, audit his course. You taught me this, you were behind this, you were the voice on the radio of the administration then, and on, fortunately not TV, but you were...
There's a reason I was on radio.
You were behind the scenes, you were in front of the effort, and quite seriously, on behalf of the nation, we should be very thankful to you for getting that modernization put through. And I mean that. Now, an understandable sunset provision causes that authority to expire at the end of this year. And the authority is for this. This is the layman's translation. It is the authority that allows us to surveil foreign, legitimately targeted foreign and national security targets, right? Foreigners on foreign land. This is not about surveilling Americans, and we're not allowed, in fact, prohibited under this authority from targeting a foreigner here in the United States, or a U.S. person in the United States, or a U.S. person in a foreign land. All those things are prohibited. This is about foreign threats in foreign land, and if you understand it that way and start explaining it to those that are in the decision-making cycle, I think you'll help the cause of at least eliminating intentional confusion or conflation between other titles under the FISA law. Titles 1 and 3 tend to be where people focus, some of the news of the day tends to focus us there. But this is about separately, not just a warrant by warrant situation. This is about a certificate in a way that allows us to use, actually let me back up, it's not use. The reason this exists is because the United States is very good and led the way in the internet. And now it can't be used against us that a foreign terrorist in a foreign land chooses to use a US internet service provider or US software. Just because we're good and they choose to use Gmail doesn't mean that we should then handicap ourselves from being able to surveil that person in a foreign land who's trying to do something bad to us. And so where I think it is, and the way I assess it, is that I believe the Senate will end up demonstrating the leadership to put into place a clean and hopefully permanent reauthorization of the law, and that we have to then go out and educate as many House reps as possible to ameliorate their concerns that we might mistreat, either unintentionally target Americans or mistreat the information that gets unintentionally collected on an American. And let me just address that very directly. Most of you know the wiretap history of this country, and you know that there are practices in place to mitigate the handling of information of innocent third parties. So if you've got a wiretap on a mobster and the grandmother down the street calls and asks him to take the trash out, there are mitigation measures in place to not record or to minimize that particular conversation on that innocent grandmother. We have the similar prohibitions and mitigation practices in place for incidentally collecting on a third-party American that might be in email communication with a legitimate foreign terrorist, for instance, target in foreign land. And so if we can explain that, and if you can get yourselves to the point where you believe my assertion, I think you will if you look into it, then you can help us educate the lawmakers who have to reauthorize this authority, and then encourage them not to think about a secondary kind of requirement where they say you have to get another warrant to then search the data you've already collected. Go out and do your lawyerly job of educating those that feel that way to understand we've already collected it lawfully. There's no reason to have a separate authority here to make us do what we've already done lawfully a second time. So that's where I assess it.
Okay.
Do you agree?
Well,
You're the expert.
I completely agree. Ditto on that. So let me just say this. Thanks to Tom for taking the time for joining us. Thanks to all of you for having us. And also, I mean this sincerely, thanks to Tom for his service. We always thank people for their government service, but there's a cadre of people who are sort of real professionals who step into the toughest jobs that come along in government at sometimes the toughest times. And Tom's a prime example of that. And just, I think we all owe him a debt of gratitude.
Okay. I ask you not to go anywhere. We're going to go straight into our next panel. We're running just a touch behind, but you will not regret staying. This is going to be a great group. Tom Bossert, thank you very much. Really appreciate it. Ken, thank you very much. Great job, guys.